I am so thrilled to be bringing you Domenica Feraud to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Today, I have so many questions about how you came to this extraordinary play that I have been reading about and wish everybody get to New York, but Someone Spectacular that you wrote in honor of your mom, right? And I can't wait to dive into the conversation about grief and creativity and storytelling and catharsis and all the things that you gifted, I think, in the world with this particular piece, although I know you've explored other really important topics, which we might touch on today in essays and books around disordered eating and around the Me Too movement and all kinds of things. So we're going to dive deep, far and wide in our conversation today, but I just wanted to welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Yeah. And also, as we'll talk about, and just sort of like welcoming in your mom, right, Nathalie, to the space. Is that right? And to just, I always like to, when I have guests on the show who are showing up with personal loss, and which is pretty much everyone, even if they're just doing work professionally around grief, to bring their person or their people into the space. So we're just going to welcome her here as we explore this conversation. Yeah. But I wanted to start where I like to start all my podcast conversations over these past 6 seasons, which is really helping us unpack the grief beliefs that we all come to hold, particularly when I think about those of us who are raised in the West, but also thinking about our other ancestry and the culture that influences us. But to do that, to unpack for many of us the earliest lessons we learned about what grief should or shouldn't look like or feel like came to us in oftentimes our young childhood or maybe our early adulthood. So I'm wondering if you can reflect back and think about an early loss in your life. Could have been a death loss or other sort of loss. And how were the adults in your life modeling explicitly, implicitly grief? And what do you think that taught you about grief? And did it prepare you for this latest season of grief in your life?
I was very lucky as a child, did not, I still have to this day, 3 out of 4 grandparents are living. And my grandmother died 8 months before my mother. So I really, I didn't experience a lot of loss in my life. 2 losses that I can think to: when I was 7, I think, my dog died of cancer. And I remember coming home from camp and my mom just sort of told me. And I don't really remember ever talking to my father about it. And my father was particularly close to the dog. And I know that for a long time we didn't get another dog for 15 years. So it was a really painful loss for them. But it wasn't really discussed with me or with my brother. It was just this thing that happened. I sort of I think I remember going to the bathroom to cry, like hiding my feelings about that. And then the nanny who helped a lot when I was little, she died when she was in her late 50s. And I found out right before Thanksgiving. We were living in London, and that was really odd. And that really impacted me, just thinking about, okay, she died and I wasn't there, and this has happened, and I'm never going to see her again. And I spent so much time with her in the formative years of my life. She was such an important person. I mean, I spent a lot of my time with her from when I was a baby to when I was 10 or 11 years old. So that one really stayed with me. But I just kind of, I think what there was to process was that my mom had heard that she was ill, and we didn't see her in time, and she didn't really tell me what was going on. So if I was going to be upset about her death, then I'd have to be upset with my mother as well. And I didn't want to do that. So I just kind of compartmentalized that when I was a teenager.
Yeah. Yeah. And so even as she informed you of the death, I'm curious, how did that show up in your lives? Was there because clearly you couldn't maybe make it to the service or something because it was too far away, but did you continue to talk about her memory? Was it sort of like she's dead and now we're moving on. Can you think about, because I just asked that out of curiosity, not out of
Yeah.
judgment, but I think it's important for all of us to recognize that sometimes the grief beliefs that we learn that maybe don't serve us so well in life aren't necessarily the explicit things people said, like don't cry or you should be over it by now or move on. Sometimes it's the absence
Hmm.
of recalling their memory or the absence of their picture. Their pictures get put away. I've had a lot of guests on, where that happened early on, or, it's more the absences. So I'm just
Mm.
curious if you can look back and think about, you know, was her memory discussed? Or was it sort of like she died and now,
No, her memory was definitely
yeah.
discussed.
Okay.
We talked a lot about her, and we talked a lot about the decision. And my mother apologized to me. I mean, she was like, look, this, like, she was kind of a hypochondriac. And so I knew when I heard she wasn't doing this, happens so often, that
Yeah.
she was sick or something was going on, and I didn't take it seriously. And that's on me. And I'm so sorry, because I really regret that. And
Gotcha.
so we did talk about it, and we had very healthy feedback where she owned responsibility, and we
Good.
talked about the impact she had on my life. And she's someone whose name came up
Yeah.
often throughout my life. So no, it's not
Yeah.
that. Her memory did live on for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I just want to remind listeners again, and you who's maybe new to the show, is when I ask these explorations, it's really just one of the many practices I invite people to do when they are navigating grief, especially if they feel some sort of way about being stuck in their grief, because sometimes without knowing, we carry these grief beliefs and these rules that we sort of apply to ourselves. And sometimes our suffering and our struggle is because it doesn't actually resonate with how we feel, but it's just
Mm.
like a belief that we've adopted and we're sort of applying to ourselves in a way. And that's sometimes where the friction is, or the suffering, or the stuckness is sort of how I think about that. I've been had a training in narrative therapy, so storytelling and how we talk to ourselves and about ourselves is really profoundly impacts us. So just as a by way of explanation for you, or for folks who are new listeners to the show, it's not about judging our parents and why didn't they do better and how come they didn't model grief. Well, of course they didn't, because for many of our parents, they also grew up in a household or in a culture that didn't teach them how to
Yeah.
have hard conversations about hard things. So that's just the backdrop I like to explain sometimes.
No,
Yeah.
I appreciate it. It's a really great question. It makes me think, and something I have thought about after losing my mother is my grandmother, her dad died when she was 16. So like
Oh,
since my mom died, we've had a lot of conversations about that, that I
interesting.
hadn't really had with her before my mom died. I hadn't really thought about it that much. And then
Yeah.
once I lived it and went through it, then I really was like, oh my God, you were 16, and what was that? And so we've had more conversations about that.
Yeah, I can imagine that might be actually, of course, devastating to your grandmother, of course, to lose, to know this loss, but also maybe meaningful to for somebody to be curious about, because I can imagine at 16 and all the intervening years, people weren't, maybe didn't have that kind of curiosity about what it was like
Yeah.
to be a 16-year-old navigating loss. And here now somebody that she loves is leaning in and asking those questions.
Yeah, I feel sad for her that I didn't ask about it more sooner. And that's and but of course, yeah, 60 years later to get to talk about it with your granddaughter, obviously for really awful reasons, but is yeah, she's coming to see the play next week, I and she's lost sibling. I think it'll be really interesting for her to see it and for us to talk afterwards.
Yeah, I want to start diving into the play, although I want to learn a little bit about your writing and performing career before we get into the play.
Yeah.
But I just want to again pivot. First of all, I can imagine that's going to be a momentous day to know, that your grandmother is in the audience, and the conversation that's going to spark. And also, again, just to pivot, I always like to sort of bring our listeners along in our conversations, which is like, we don't want to have these things happen that open the door for us to have these hard conversations with family members, whether they're grandparents or aunts or uncles. And I do think there is some real opportunity there to get really curious and to deepen our connections with people in our lives once that door has been opened for us, that door of grief and loss, and understanding what it feels like to walk there can, if we let it, be instructional to be bring more compassion to bear to our relationships and to deepen our connections with people. Because this is, as my favorite party opening line is, 100% of us are all going to die, and 100% of us are going to experience grief multiple times in our lives. I promise I'm fun at a party, but Right? But this is true, right? And this is a way
Yeah,
I think we pretend that it's like it's out there and it's not gonna happen to us. And so when we do cross these thresholds, um, I do think having these more open conversations about what it was like is not too late, even if it's your grandparent or your older uncle or aunt or somebody, and it can deepen our understanding of ourselves and our relationships. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So you have this play that is running. What this is your second play,
Second play. Yeah.
second play. So I
Second
think
produced play. There is another one that I did write in between the two that I just haven't had produced yet
released.
because of my
Yes.
mother's death. That sort of put everything really just put a lot on pause. So
Ah,
it's a play I would like to do in the future. But yeah, so this
yeah,
is, I guess technically it is my third play, but it's really
yeah.
my second play with
Second
a production
produced
that's
play.
being done.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Hear that, producers out there? She's wanting to bring that to the stage. Although I don't think you're going to have any hard time doing that. But I want to talk about someone spectacular, and as I said, I didn't get to see it live, but I've been diving deep into the premise and the characters, and we're going to unpack that because I'm so curious to think how you thought through which perspectives of grief, because you have people experience different kinds of loss and the characters that you drew. I want to get there. And yet I want to talk a little bit about the what led up to that, right? So this probably was not a play you thought you were ever going to write, maybe. Though you've tackled difficult subjects. As I said, remind me if it was The Movie Star and Me was an essay,
Yes.
right, that you wrote about your own experience, akin to the Me Too movement. You wrote 26-Year-Old Virgin, which was a book.
Was an essay as
It
well.
was an essay as well. Okay. So you've tackled some hard topics, or what
Yes.
we think of as hard topics in the world. So that's not new to you. But I can imagine you didn't think, I'm going to write a play about grief. And then tell us a little bit about what happened, a little bit about Natalie, and not in that expose way. You don't have to get into the details, but how you arrived to be a person deeply, I think, surprised. I've heard you say in an interview, surprised yourself that it came pouring out so quickly after the loss, that you were compelled to write this play that explores really deeply the experience of grief. But so just whatever you want to share with us about how you
Yeah.
came to that place, and what you want to share about your mom, that it's important for us to know about her too.
So my mom, Natalie, was my best friend. She was 22 when she had me, and she came from a very abusive childhood home. So she and my dad, they made a promise when they got married that they would never do that with their own children. I think you can go into,
Right. It
unfortunately,
can go
that's
either
less
way.
common. It can go either
Yeah.
way. And they held very true to that promise. They were really, really incredible parents. And I mean, no one's perfect, right? There definitely were the things that they were very young, they were very traumatized, and we really grew up together. That was the thing that, like, so my mom and I were absolutely best friends, and we had to work on that eventually. Once I reached my 20s, it was like, let's be mother
Boundaries.
daughter first and best friends second. But that we had such a, I mean, really, my mom was my North Star. Like, as long as she was there, everything made sense in my life. And I even remember, like, my plans from I was single and okay being single. And I thought, even my future planning of, I know I want children, but I'll foster or adopt, and my mom will be like my co parent because she would be an amazing grandmother. And we've talked about how her mother wasn't able to be a
Yes.
grandmother to me because of her mental illness. So we're going to fix that. And so we just, it, I mean, my God, we just,
She was so
we were two
integral
peas
into
in a
your
pod.
identity, and
Yes.
I mean, not that most
Yes.
of us, we hope we have a mother and a father who are integral to identity, but what I hear you saying is you were even more connected because in a way you guys grew up together in a way, or came
Yeah.
into your, yeah, life
We
together.
really did. I mean, I felt like she was my mom and my partner and my child and my sibling, and like it was
Yeah.
just so, and my friend. There was so much in that relationship. And I think for me, I knew I was many things in this world, but I primarily, being my mother's daughter was just really important to me, and not because it felt like an obligation,
Yeah.
because I loved her, and and she was my favorite person. And it was just this, I always felt there was somebody who I knew everything about and who knew everything about me and who I felt safe with and understood by. Even when she drove me crazy and even when we would fight and criticize each other, like there was just this we're both very honest people. We're both justice seekers, a little bit to a fault. We really push for what's right. And I think that just the way that we live our lives was like quite similar.
Yeah.
So I felt very understood by her. And she was young, right? So my
Yeah.
mom, because she had me at 22, she was only 22 years older than me. So I thought she would be around forever. I mean,
Yeah.
when my mom would talk about things, like my mother, total fashionista, loved her jewelry, never did it for other people. It was really for her. And I think a way of actually honoring her mother, because although her mother gave her such terrible things, she really tried to cling on to what was good.
Yeah.
And part of that was this love of fashion and this love of beautiful things. So that was, I think, my mother's own way of honoring her mom. And my mom would talk about like, well, when I die, like who's gonna wear my jewelry? You don't care. You're not gonna care about any of these things. And I say, well, mom, when you die, I'm gonna be like 80, so it doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Maybe I'll care about it then, and who cares? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it was such an abstract idea. We talked about me taking care of her. It was all gonna go. My dad always thought that my mom would outlive him for sure. It was just so unimaginable. And what happened with my mom was that she was very healthy, and then one day she had a pain in her side, and they said she went to the doctor. They said it was pneumonia. She took antibiotics for pneumonia. She wasn't getting better. And a lot of weeks were wasted and she was really starting to disintegrate. It was very scary. We took her to the hospital. I believe it was May 9th or 10th, and they found a tumor, and 3 weeks later she was dead. So it was just,
So
I mean,
fast.
my mom was at the theater with me, with company, on April 19th, and she was dead May 31st. So it was just like, yeah, I'll never understand what happened. And
Yeah.
I realized very quickly after she died, it will drive me crazy if I try to,
Yeah.
being the
Yeah.
justice seeker that we are, if I
Yes.
try to like figure this out, it's just,
Yeah.
I can't, life is too, I've just realized this world does not make sense.
No. Yeah.
You can have someone who, my mom was very, very healthy, active, organic, so careful about what she put into her body, such a like loving person who took a lot of the terrible things she went through, and rather than having that like woe is me, I've had such a difficult life, would
Yeah.
look at it and be like, how can I grow from this? How can I move on? What have I learned? How can I be better? You could go to my mom and say, hey mom, you did this thing. It's like, you're being, I mean, it took me a while to figure out that I was bisexual, and I was always kind of scared to tell her. And I was like, mom,
Yeah.
you've made some biphobic comments in the past. And she would go, you know what, you're right. And then she would go read Glennon Doyle and read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and send them to my door and tell her friends, well, do you know about the Kinsey scale? And do you know, like, if Pablo dies tomorrow, maybe I'll end up with a woman. You never know. So my mom was so open and just such a
Yeah.
healthy, beautiful soul. So there was such purity going on. It was just, I mean, for me, it felt like I woke up and my life was a nightmare. And I just didn't recognize it. And I didn't really want to be here anymore. And it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to die, but it felt wrong to be where she was not.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was the primary thing. It just felt so wrong and difficult to stay here. And I knew she would want me to. And I knew that my father and my brother and my mom's sister, my cousin, like the people who are
Yeah.
closest people, of course, we've been through I mean, my father said, I went for a run the night she died because I needed to. I needed to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
And my dad said, like, I cannot go through, he was just worried about me going running,
Yeah.
and he's like,
Yeah.
I cannot go through anything else. But I was a zombie for a very long
Yeah.
time, and I didn't think I would write again or write much of anything. I used to act and I sort of stopped. I really, like, I auditions would come in and I would just ignore them until eventually my agents were like, goodbye, my acting agents. And I understood, what was I going to say? I mean, I'd been ignoring their emails and not been responding. So it just was it was very difficult to do much of anything. I was staying up until 4 or 5 in the morning, waking up at like 2 p.m., just really checking out of life.
Yeah.
I actually, one of our producers on this play, Paige Evans, who's amazing, and after the movie starring me happened, I met Paige, and she sort of like healed my mentorship experience, I would say. She
Good.
was a
Okay.
really wonderful support to me when I was starting to re-enter the theater world after that experience. And Paige texted me one day and she's like, Domenica, I'm so sorry. She came to the funeral and she's like, I'm so sorry about your mom. And although I lost my parents, when I was older and it was different, I know her mother died of cancer and she was just like, I am here if you ever want to go for a walk or anything. And we would start going for these walks, and eventually at first we would just talk about my mom and talk about her parents and just have these conversations, and then eventually she would ask me if I was writing and I would be like, no, that's okay. And then one day I would spend a lot of time rewatching shows for comfort in bed,
Oh yeah.
and it was my dad who said to me, because when I was a teenager, I used to write Gossip Girl fan fiction. And my dad said to me, sweetie, that makes you so happy. It made you so happy. And why not try just something silly, writing something silly that doesn't mean anything so that you can at least have fun. So I started writing Gossip Girl fan fiction. It was so silly. And I had one of my walks with Paige. And I said, Paige, I am writing actually. I'm writing Gossip Girl fan fiction. And she said, Domenica, and this is a very accomplished woman. And she goes, Domenica, that is fantastic. I'm thrilled. That is so good that you're writing. And that really stayed with me. So I mean, I don't think this play would have existed had it not been for the Gossip Girl fan fiction, had it not
Yeah.
been for the letters to my mother that I scribbled down on I wrote to my mom so much that first year. I wrote to her constantly. I
Yeah.
always carried a pen and paper to just talk to her.
Yeah.
And so it was March when I wrote Someone Spectacular. So my mom died May 31st, 2022. This was like early March 2023. And I was going on a trip with my dad and his girlfriend and her kids. And like that was difficult for a bunch of reasons.
I'm
And
sure.
I had a lot of projects that I wanted to work on and that I was supposed to be working on, including that other play. And this play happened instead. It
Poured out
really
of you.
surprised me the way it just had to. There was a day that I was in my dad's office writing, and he came in and found me sobbing and was like, sweetie, maybe it's too soon. And I was like, I have to write this.
Yeah.
And I never planned for it to happen. It just did. And my goodness, I'm so glad it did.
It did. And I want to pause there because we're going to pivot and dive into what Someone Spectacular came out. But I want to reflect back to you. And again, listeners, first of all, thank you for sharing your mom with us and her fashion with us and her positive outlook on life with us. And I can see that energy in you. And I appreciate when people bring their people into the room with us. So first, thank you for that. And also
Thank
a
you
couple,
for inviting her.
oh, of course. Your play is doing this. I think I just think the more we do this, it's going to heal so many things for all of us at the individual and collective level. So this is part of my mission in this work. I also want to pause and pick up something that you said that I want to reflect back, which is this very common experience, but also so not talked about again because we get scared about talking about difficult things, which was this experience that you had that so many of us have, which was I didn't want to live, which is different than I want to die. And I just want to because I can imagine folks listening to you felt maybe had a visceral knowing in their own body, like, yeah, I felt that too. And for so many of us, I think we've been scared to say it because the reaction of culture is like, oh my gosh, you're suicidal, and panic ensues and not that we shouldn't attend to the cues of people's risk of suicidality. I'm not saying that because there really is a risk there, but it's just such a common experience in grief to, as you said, your identity was so tied up in your relationship with your mother. And when with your mother gone, it's like, who am I in the world? And how do I navigate a world without her? And do I want to navigate a world? And so anyways, I don't want to belabor it, but I didn't want to skate over it because I think it's such a common experience that I think so many people are scared to let out. And the keeping it in actually makes us more worried about ourselves, or we pathologize ourselves in ways that I don't think are necessary just to normalize it.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. I had a lot of friends I could tell they were worried about me, but they
Yeah.
appreciated that I said it out loud, that I
Yeah.
was talking about these things. And there came a point where I was hit by a scooter. I was
Oh
running,
boy.
and that was a real wake up call. And I, my friends were, and my family, everyone was of course worried. And I I remember telling one of my friends, like, yeah, when after it happened and it was not good. I had a
Yeah.
really bad concussion, but I was going to ignore it. I wasn't going to go to the doctor. I was terrified of hospitals after there was a lot
Yes.
of medical error that took place with my mother. And so I
Yeah.
was just really scared. But there was a point where I was running and you can hear the clicking in your head and you can feel things moving. And it's
Yeah.
not
You're
good.
like,
And there
this
was
is
blood
not right.
everywhere. And this is not right. And I thought, well, I was supposed to go to the theater and I thought, well, if I die, at least I'll be with mom. And then I stopped and
That really
I
caught you.
yeah, that
Yeah.
caught me and I called my dad and I went to the ER and I got the head CT and everything and was supervised for a while and that really did catch me and my dad and my aunt were not happy with me and I did have a conversation with my aunt where I said, "Yeah, I struggle to be here and like, how could I not?
Yeah.
How could I not struggle
Yeah.
to be here after this? It makes sense. I'm not doing anything about it. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just
Yeah.
saying I don't recognize my life and I do and part of not I do feel like part of me did die.
Yes.
My whole identity, so much of me died with
Yes.
my mom and I'm figuring out who I am now and this is very very painful. And so yeah, it is really hard to be here. And my aunt was able to then say to me like me
Me
too.
too.
It's
Yeah.
also hard and that was just really freeing. And my dad had his own struggles. There's actually a monologue in the play where his character, who seems to be the put together businessman,
Yeah.
who is dating and you think is okay. And then you hear that this guy almost stepped in front of a bus because he's like, nothing makes sense without what's the point of living without her? So
Yeah.
I think these are very common and I know today is actually like grief awareness
Yes.
day and
It is.
our social media team posted some reminders and I added a few and I said like one of them is don't be so quick to say, well, your loved one would want you to be happy because
Yeah.
it's okay to be like it's okay.
Yeah.
It actually would be very odd for you to be happy all the time or at all right now.
In
Like that's
life,
okay.
let alone in grief, by the way, because that's also a
Yeah,
myth, like this toxic positivity. Yeah.
very
Oh,
toxic.
I'm so appreciative both that you reflected that back out to our listeners, but also that you were able to have some of those conversations with the people in your life. Because also by you being vulnerable and sharing those things, even though their maybe initial reaction was out of fear because they loved you and
Yeah,
wanted you to be safe, you also by modeling that gave them permission to say, me too. Like,
right.
oh, I felt that way too. And part of this unnecessary suffering that we experience in grief is because we feel othered and we have to keep away the very real and messy thoughts, emotions, experiences that we have and we think it's just us. It's only happening to me. There's something wrong with me. So, though it feels risky sometimes to say those thoughts that we know might be scary to other people and scary to ourselves, as you said, it kind of scared you, it's such a gift because it actually brings us more together if we can do it with the people who can really hear us.
I think
Yeah.
it's very important, and there is a big prevalence of suicide right now, especially with
Yes.
the younger generation. Part of it, I think if people were more able to openly
Yeah.
discuss
Yeah.
what they were feeling, that would make a difference.
Yes. Yeah.
Because to talk about it and to have that dialogue around it, like when we feel like we can't say anything and we have to keep it inside, that's actually when
Right.
terrible things happen, I
Exactly.
think.
We don't have the choice. And so one of the things that I appreciate what you said, which is, you know, you had some people gently in your life reminding you what are the skills or practices or resources, that's the way I think about it, that's my therapy language, but whatever, what are the things that
I
you
love
do in
therapy language.
life that have served you in the past? And for you, that's writing. And for some of us, that might be writing, but in a more casual way. Maybe we haven't been essayists or, playwriters. But so before we get to the play, I promise we're going to get there. I want you to talk about, because for somebody listening, it might be hiking or nature walks, or it
Hmm.
might be painting, or it might be, taking care of animals or, whatever is their thing. How did you not resist trying that thing that you knew made you feel better? Because I know for a lot of us, it's like we want to feel better, but also doing something to make us feel better can feel bad in a way. Like, I don't want to feel better because that's somehow dishonoring to my person. So when you started writing, what do you remember about that time? And did you have any like fits and starts, or once you started writing, you were just it was just porn, not necessarily the play, but the gossip, like the early
Yeah.
writing you were doing, or the writing to your mother, by the way, which is profound.
And I also want to say a lot of the things that you described like also saved me. I mean, I was not a runner before
Yeah.
my mom died, and
Okay.
now I just my when I heard the word cancer,
Yeah.
6 miles. I was just running all the time. I
Yeah.
ran after the funeral. I might have like killed some people otherwise. It was just
Yes.
the funeral
Yeah.
was so hard. And I just having that hour to myself.
Yes.
My mom's dog, I spend so much time with. I haven't seen her for a week. My dad took her away for the weekend because of the play. I can't, and
Yeah.
tomorrow I'm finally going to get to see her. And it's like I mean, that just being with that animal,
Yeah.
the peace and I feel like I'm with my mom to some degree. So yes, whatever it is that
Yeah.
everyone does, it's like that you find peace. Those things are so, so
Yeah.
important. I also became a vociferous reader after my mom. I just would read everything she read and read 50 pages. There are so many ways of coping
Yeah.
that have been invaluable to me. With writing, yeah, I felt so divorced from like my mom, when she realized she was going to die, she asked me, "Why were you born?" And that question was just
Mm.
stunned me because I felt like she was telling me, "I'm going to die. And you need a reason for living that has nothing to do with me. So you can't
Oh,
say to be your daughter." And that, I think she saved my life with that question to answer it. And it was so hard. And I didn't know what to say because all I wanted to say was to be your daughter. And I think I believe the first thing I said was to write. And I do feel like this play is in many ways the beginning of my answering
yeah.
this question that she posed to me. And that guides me. I have it tattooed on my wrist and the inside of my wrist with her handwriting. My brother said to me, when people die, they leave a gift for those closest to them, and you were the recipient of that gift, so you have to let it guide you for forever. And I do. It was really painful to be so scared of writing. At
Yeah.
first, it felt really scary, and I just, yeah, of course, I didn't to continue on to do something to make art when she can't read it. My
Yeah.
mom was also my reader. My mom would read everything with the movie star and me. I wrote that piece in 2020, January 2021. I did not publish it until January 2022. And I cannot tell you the amount of times that I called my mom and would read the essay, this long, it used to be like 15,000 words. I mean, the amount of cutting that was done to get it into the form that, because I didn't, now I'm with a publisher and I have a wonderful editor for my book
Yeah.
that will be coming out next year. But back then I didn't. I had
Yes.
agents, but I mean, they're amazing, but they're not going to like line edit everything with me.
Yeah.
My mom would listen to it all and tell me, "That's boring, cut that out, that's too repetitive." I mean, she was so instrumental for my process as a writer.
Yeah.
So to write things that she wasn't going to, I think that's why at first I had to write to her. That was the only thing that made sense to me. And in the
Yes.
hospital, when she was in the hospital every day to like make sense of what was going on, because watching somebody die from an illness in 3 weeks is a really crazy experience. You're like watching the amount of deterioration that usually occurs over months and years
Yeah.
happen in a day. I mean, I would leave the hospital at 9 p.m. and come in the next day, and it would be a different I mean, it was
Yes.
just like
Yeah.
whatever progress we had made, there was some new obstacle that you could never imagine. It was just like being whacked constantly, and it was so terrifying. So every day at night, I would call the hospital. I would like be like, "Is she breathing? Is she okay?"
Yeah.
And I would write her letters. I would just write letters to her in my notebook. And so after she passed away, it took me a while, but I started to write her letters. And actually, I'm now remembering what it really was that pulled me to write was this. I'm a big theater nerd,
Okay. Yeah.
huge. Yeah,
Bring it
like
on.
big
Bring it
time
on. Yeah. I
obsessive.
love it.
The last show I saw with my mom, the actress in that show, Katrina Lenk, who I've adored for a long time, her manager goes to Soul Cycle with my aunt and their friends. So the manager texted my aunt and said, "I'm so sorry about your sister. If there's anything I can do, please let me know." And my aunt responded and said, "Actually, there is. Domenica is obsessed with company. She's seen it so many times. And since Natalie's death, like she's all the only thing that makes this girl, like I can see where she's at any sort of modicum of peace is for the 3 hours that she watches that show. So would it be possible for her to write a letter to Katrina?" And this friend of my aunt said yes. So I then had this task, and it was that actually that gave me a purpose and that gave me something. And I wrote this letter that was about me and my mother, but also about Katrina's performance. It was just this, and it was so special to write it. And then I remember this was like the first time I felt happy, or like I had permission to be happy,
Yes.
was when I got a text from my aunt saying like, okay, she was so happy to tell me like Katrina read the letter and she wants to invite you to come see the show as her guest and like to talk to you after the show. So that was sort of, I think that letter reminded me I was
Yes.
a writer.
Yeah.
But then, and meeting Katrina and having this amazing experience with her was so special. But then after that, like I didn't have a, then it came in the guilt, then came in the, well, I don't,
Well, what do I do with this
writing makes me
now?
feel good and I don't know that I can feel, and it feels like a betrayal, and I feel all of the things that you're describing. So I think that the task my dad gave me, doing something that was so low, like the combination of
Yes.
when the pain was too much, the letters to my mom helped me, and I could tell, I told her those things, by the way, I told her
Yeah.
those things like, it is wrong, it feels wrong to be where you are not, like those were like I told her all of the darkest thoughts, I told her what
Yeah.
it was, and I wondered, what would this do to you? What would it be like for you if I died? I'm actually, in a way, I'm glad that you don't have to go through that.
Yeah.
So, because this is unbearable, I would really let it out. And that I think was really healthy and helpful. And I've saved them all. I would like to publish them one day.
Yeah.
And then combined with the silliness and the low stakes of just
Yeah.
this thing that I really did take very seriously. I really plotted out this like fanfic that
Yeah.
is that I'm quite proud of. And so I think those two things eventually made the act of writing less heavy for me
Yeah.
and
And less
easier to
far
sort of go
away and
into.
yeah. Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for walking us through that and for naming a couple of things again that I think folks can experience too, which are those moments of like trying things that used to help. Sometimes they don't help early on, but also then having those moments of happiness or at least neutrality, I always say, or ease, and then feeling weird about feeling
Mhm.
neutral or happy or okay, and still, charging forward anyways and just building that musculature of being able to be holding the both and of grieving and being okay in the world whenever we get there. And not that we get there and arrive there, by the way, it's we come and go, right?
I'm
And
realizing this.
yes, okay, so yes, we come and go and it's okay. And we just become more equipped at carrying the grief over time. That's really what it is. The grief doesn't get smaller, we just become more capable of carrying it, and
That's what
that's
I say to people, that like I've learned to live without my mother. And that's its own really painful thing, but I miss her more. It's not like the missing and the pain
right.
is that it's just not subsuming my entire identity as a
Exactly.
human being anymore, but it's
Exactly.
still
Yeah.
very present.
Yeah. I mean, so I use a narrative metaphor whenever I say, which is like in the beginning, grief is our whole story. And over time, grief becomes a chapter of our story. And it doesn't mean that this is any less substantial or that that chapter of our story, it doesn't influence the who we are and how we live in the world. It's just that we build a life around that chapter. It's like, and you would
Mm.
never ask somebody who wrote a novel to like read the first chapter, get to chapter 3, rip out chapter 1 and forget about that, right? Like chapter 1 was very influential to where the characters go, the plot, everything that happens. And that's how I think about our life. So, anyhow, sorry, I could get lost in the narrative story, but that unlocked, it sounds like, a lot of things. It got you to the place in your grief where you could hold maybe having ease and also missing your mom. It also unlocked the kind of the pressure because you had been a professional writer previous to this. And then you're at this really important crossroads where you're on this family trip, your dad has a girlfriend, it's the potential to unlock all of these things, and before you knew it, you started developing what turned out to be this profound play on grief. Someone spectacular, and the premise, as I recall, was maybe 6 random strangers who were showing up at a grief support group, and the grief support guide maybe goes missing. But
Yeah.
I think I've heard you say, or tell me a little bit about it, that I just even heard you say that some of these characters are in a way either borrowed from people, yourself, your mom, maybe your aunt, your dad. But how did that dialogue pour out of you? How did you think about both what they were saying, but also which kinds of losses you were going to represent? Because if you're picking 6 strangers, like, is it, miscarriage? Is it the sudden death of a person? How did the sort of shape of this show come to be? How did you it sounds like it poured out, not to trivialize or simplify the hard work you put in, but
No, it definitely did. I mean, it became, at first it poured out, and then it was when we were in rehearsals watching the worst time in our life over and over and over again. I mean, I could not sleep. I could not go to the bathroom. Like, I was buying prunes. It was not fun. And now it's now like, I remember once the play was locked, which is when I, as a writer, can no longer make changes. I then could derive like enjoyment from watching the play, but it was so hard for those months of kind of looking at my family's grief and being like, what's interesting and what's not? What will an audience connect to and what won't they find
yeah.
interesting? And let me cut that line. That was very
So you
odd
sort of
and
have to being like
painful.
intellectual in a way, but also very deeply personally connected to the experience of grief. But then moving back and forth between those hats must have been a particularly odd experience.
It was. I'm very grateful for the clarity of our director, Tatiana Pandiani, and Paige, who was dramaturg on this. So having their insight was also really, really helpful for me because I knew, especially if they were agreed on something, because I was a little too close. So it was like, okay, that is very helpful. And of course, our actors. I really think actors are wonderful collaborators, and they are inhabiting these people and bringing them to life. So if they say like this doesn't fit in with my character, or where I think they are at their life, or like how they think
Yeah.
about things, I take that very seriously, and I do often make changes from that point of view. But going back to how these characters and these six experiences came into being. So the interesting thing is you start this play, watching this play, and you do think it's six strangers and they're here for grief counseling, and where is the grief counselor? Even the first 10 minutes of the play occur in total silence. I mean, the characters are just like, everyone's coming in. Some people are early, some people are on time, some people are late, some people are very late, and they're doing different things that are, you actually learn a lot about the characters in those 10 minutes. You really, really do. Just in what are they doing? What are they
Yes.
doing while they're waiting for this woman, wondering what's going on? And the first line of the play spoken is, it's been 10 minutes. So I want the audience to feel that discomfort of like, what is going on? To feel like the characters feel of
Yes.
what's happening, where, and sometimes people get mad and people are like, why aren't they closing the doors? The show should be starting. And there are actors there, but, and it's interesting because I'm like, yeah, you're going through what they're going through.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting to me. And it's interesting to me to have a grief, like grief is an experience where you are processing that you have lost someone. And
Yeah.
the person that you then go to guide you through this is
Is
now also
gone.
gone. That is just, that's going to bring out a lot. Because if we were to take a grief counseling session and turn it
Yeah.
into a play, it likely wouldn't be very interesting. I mean, we go to theater for something that is heightened and is a
Yeah.
different experience. And what allows these characters, of course, it would be interesting and moving, but
Yeah.
it would just be, it's
A
not
different,
theater.
yeah.
It's not something we're watching. So,
One thing,
um,
one, just sorry, one thing I am noticing as you're even describing that, like here these people show up for a grief support group and then like the person who is supposed to help them doesn't show up, feels very much a very valid metaphor for what happens to most of us in grief who
yes.
have the people who we for sure thought were going to show up for us. And so many
Hmm.
grievers I've talked to on the show, in sessions, in my work, over time, didn't. And so I think to make an audience walk through, and even though there's the discomfort there, I imagine as an audience member, there's some knowing of that feeling like I'm showing up to have someone hold space for my grief. And the person who I've asked to do that can't do it. So I don't
Yeah.
know if that was like an intentional metaphor, but that felt very, as you were describing it, felt very resonant to the very lived experience of pretty much every griever I've ever met.
Yeah, that is something that I really appreciate about the structure of the play, that it is act
Yeah.
like what they're going through is actually what you go through in grief. And that's sort of the play. It seems very realistic when it starts, but as it continues, you kind of realize these characters are like stuck in a version of purgatory. And although they seem to be six strangers, the actual conceit of the play, the little mystery that's going on, and I talked about this with the audience yesterday, is that we had a talk back yesterday.
Yeah.
They're actually a family, and they are grieving so individually and intensely that they don't recognize each other. That is what's really going on. So like, although two of it's different. So in the play, it's talked about how Beth, who is the leader of this group who's missing, that Beth likes her groups to be on the same timelines. For the six members, their loss all happened 4 months ago. So one of the characters says that's a little weird. And it's like, well, yes, it is. It is a little weird because they're all mourning the same person. So then one of them, Evelyn, her loss happened 6 months ago. And then one of them is brand new to the group and has just arrived. So the thing is, Evelyn is the someone spectacular. She's the person who has died for the other four. And
Mm.
Jude, the character who just showed up last week, is her 30 years ago when she was going through a miscarriage. And I talked to the actors a lot about like the reason Jude has just shown up last week is because she's now that like when you're grieving, at first you're missing the person that you knew and who was with you. But then I know, like for me, I started going through and finding old pictures of my mother or old like diaries and all of these things because you want to know all of them. So that's why Jude has just shown up now.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of supernatural elements in the play that sort of hint that more is going on. There's like a strange beeping noise that the characters struggle to identify that is actually a heart monitor. So it's kind of the significance is that trauma that they're never going to be able to shake, and that noise is coming in to try to remind them like, okay, you're all arguing and you're comparing
Yeah.
about whose loss is like about the
Yeah.
hierarchy, but really this thing, don't let it divide you, let it bring you together because you share this. And that was, I think, really interesting to me to explore how grief, I understand how grief completely tears families apart because you're looking at no two people grieve the same. And it does feel like, okay, we now share this language, so we should be closer or have this, but you whatever dialect you're speaking in
Yeah.
is unrecognizable to me. It's the opposite of how I feel, and that is really scary. One of the things my mom said to us on, it's so weird to say, but yes, on her deathbed,
Yeah.
was to love each other.
Yeah.
And that advice, thank God she said it, because there are times I don't know that I would be as close to my brother or my father as I am now. We've had ugly fights. It's been hard. We really worked through it because of what she said and how we have like the love that we have for her and our dedication to honoring what she wanted
Yes.
for her family and how to process this terrible thing. So the characters were very familiar to me because they're my family.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so like Lily is there grieving her mom that she adored, and Lily is the worst version of me. Lily isn't really me. She's kind of, but she is sort of how I felt right after my mom died. And she's a lot of the things I think but don't say. I also made her be extra angsty because I'm
Because
not going to have characters based on my father or my mother or my cousin be like the horrible one. You know, it's
right.
gonna it's
Right.
gonna have
Right.
to be me. So then Tom is there grieving the loss of his wife. That's based
Yeah.
on my father. Nell is there grieving her sister. That's based on my aunt. Julian is there grieving the loss of his beloved aunt, who was more like a mother to him. That's my cousin. And then Evelyn is there grieving her mother, who she actually like, who I told you my mother had a very complicated childhood,
Yeah.
who traumatized and abused her. And she finds herself heartbroken by her death, which she never expected. So we do have that disenfranchised grief
Yes.
represented in the play. And then there's Jude, who's had a miscarriage and is sort of going, that's a very dismissed experience and
Yes.
something my mother had a second trimester miscarriage before she had me, and I know that stayed with her for her whole life. So it was really important to me in this play to explore the different versions. We have three people who society would more like look at and take more seriously, right? In terms of
Yes.
Tom, it's his wife of 30 years.
The
Lily, it's her
daughter.
young mother. Nell, it's her sister. I mean, those things like that, those things society takes pretty seriously. But for the nephew with the aunt,
Right.
that, I mean, I remember like it's part of the play how he says, no one at work said anything, and they were inviting me to happy hour after the funeral. And then you have the character who's like, I should be relieved. I always thought I'd be relieved when she died, and I'm not. I'm a mess, and I don't know what's going on. And we have the woman who's like, I'm terrified that if you realize over the course of it, she's actually pregnant now, and
Mm.
she's like, I'm so scared that she's so
That.
scared of telling her husband, because she's like, I can't do that to him. Like, it's bringing it all back up
Yeah.
again. It's
Yeah.
bringing it all back up. And there hasn't been a system in place for her to process this, because there still isn't. I mean, even 30
No.
years later, we don't make a lot of space for women to talk about miscarriages.
No. Even though
So
it's
yeah,
so
that was
common.
something.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I am blown away. I'm literally calculating, can I get on a plane and fly to New York before this show is done? I'm in California, so I'm not sure that's going to happen. But I just really want to draw out so much wisdom and what a beautiful representation of so many of the aspects of grief that so many families, pretty much most families go through that we don't talk about enough, which is the fact that we're all quote unquote grieving the same person, but it's not the same grief
Yes, it's not.
because we're grieving our relationship
Hmm.
with that person, are the identity story that we have entangled, wife, mother, son, nephew, friend, etc. Plus then we all have our own different styles of coping with things. We might be more emotive, or we might be more practical, or there's all those things. And then there's the ways in which people are showing up to comfort some of us and not others of us, as you said about the disenfranchised grief. And to put that on display for an audience is so powerful, because I think part of, again, I always come back to part of my work is to really reduce the myths and sort of uncover all of the myths and the problematic and singular narrow stories we have about grief and loss that cause us so much unnecessary suffering. And I think so often people assume, well, we all lost that person, and if you're not grieving the way I am, then there's something wrong with you, or there's something wrong with me, because we've all bought into grief has to look the same way for all of us, and that there's a competition or a hierarchy. And it sounds like you were able to unpack, actually, that's not what's happening. And yet I'm curious, did you, of course you had to have artistic license as the writer and the creator, but how did you have the characters without giving too much away? Was there a recognition that, oh, actually we're judging each other from a lens that doesn't make sense, and how might we understand each other? Or how do you think about that as a writer to bring some clarity there for your characters?
I think the characters go through such a journey in this play.
Yeah.
And what becomes clear is that because Beth, the grief counselor, isn't coming, they all have their own moments of being Beth, of becoming Beth, and kind of helping each other. And it gets really ugly in the play. There is some horrible things said. I mean, one of the members is very judgmental to the woman who's gone through the miscarriage. Lily, who's like shadow me, is
Yeah.
awful to everyone and is really judgmental of Tom for dating and says awful stuff too.
Yeah.
The ugliest things are said, and yet they choose to stay in the room and work through it together. And at the end of the play, even when it's like, okay, time's up, Beth isn't coming,
Yeah.
let's just go. Lily is the one who's like, I'm not ready to be alone. Like, I don't want to be alone, and stay. And they do stay. And that, I think, was a really, I was asked recently, what is the play about? And I
Yeah.
answered it because I think it's about so many things, but
Exactly.
it's also about choosing to stay in the room, even when it is painful and uncomfortable and
Yeah.
messy and ugly, because grief is all of those things. And it's just, they choose to stay together and work through it. And the kind of metaphor of them all being Beth is, of course, the metaphor of everyone figuring out how to find the person you've lost inside of you and channel her at different times. I mean, my
Yeah.
mom was so much the glue of our family. And so without her, I remember when my dad told me that it was cancer, the first thing I said was not mom. And I didn't mean it like I want anyone else to die. I
Yeah.
just meant it like she's everyone's person. Like she's
Yeah.
dad's most important person, and she's my most important person, and she's Lucas's, my brother's most important person, and she's the dog's most important person. And like,
Yeah.
what are we going to do
Yeah.
without her? And I think I remember her therapist telling me repeatedly, we would talk often afterwards, and she would tell me, have you found her inside of you yet? And when we all finally, now that I see the moments where my aunt is finding my mom inside her and channeling her. And I see the moments where my father, like the way he lives his life is really by like letting her guide him, and he
Yeah.
honors her so beautifully in his way. I see the ways my brother, and I think that interesting thing in the play of them all becoming Beth, the
Yeah.
grief counselors, also them all being for each other that person who's not there that they do need, and like figuring out how to do that together. It's quite beautiful to watch, as scary as and uncomfortable as it can be at times, because gosh, people say the worst things in this play, but that's what happened. I mean,
But
grief
that's
really, yeah, it bears you will be shocked at what comes. I was so, yeah, there were times where I didn't recognize myself. And of course I didn't. Like I said earlier, I
Yeah.
died too as a
Yeah.
new person.
And we don't know. We are so lost in the wilderness, in the depths of our grief. And of course, we say, I mean, we are at that guttural primal, I think of the guttural primal screams that so many of us, myself
Hmm.
included, that emit from us. And we are just clawing our way to survive. And for a while, as we talked about earlier, we maybe can't even imagine a world in which we do survive this loss. And so, not that we're permission giving to go out and say all the worst things to people. And yet, of course, we often do, or say those worst things to ourselves, because we're trying to orient in a world that doesn't make sense anymore. We're trying to bear the
Yeah.
unbearable. We're trying to navigate the unnavigable, it feels.
Mm.
And so I appreciate that you didn't, it doesn't sound like sugarcoat sort of the, Hollywood catharsis and we're all coming to see each
No.
other, that you really allowed us to see, maybe, as you said, an even shadower, maybe more exaggerated versions of ourselves, maybe some more accurate of us, but you allowed us to see that as an audience, and that it doesn't sound like, instead of tying it up in a neat bow, something you said earlier really I appreciated, which is Lily, the character that represents you, or maybe the shadow you, was like, I don't know where we go from here, but I don't want to do it alone. Let's keep, like, it's still messy, but let's just keep showing up,
Yeah.
being messy together, and kind of figuring our way forward. Does that feel
Yeah.
like an accurate
That
representation?
does. When I talked earlier about my mom and how we're both very honest people, to do the Hollywood thing, to tie it up in a bow, would just have felt the opposite of honest to
Yeah.
me. I think this is a play that I've seen now the way it does speak to those who are grieving, and it's I learn a lot from the audience members who come, even if I
Yeah.
don't talk to them, just from
Yeah.
watching how they
Yeah.
interact with the play. I learn so very much. And I think that I don't think it would have this. I mean, I've felt so frustrated when people would tell me, even now, I'll like post something about missing my mom. And when I get the well meaning messages of like,
She
it will
wouldn't
get
want
better with
you to
time,
be blah, 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 or,
like it'll get easier when time goes by. I mean, the amount of people who told me she's in a better place at the funeral, or those things that people just say. And it's like, no, this play is not doing any of that.
good,
It's
good.
not making you any promises. There are no platitudes. It's very human, I would say. Very deeply human.
Deeply human. And we need more stories like these, which is why when I heard about it, I was so excited to have you on the show, because I think those other stories, those other versions that we're talking about, the ones that tie up in a neat bow, do us such a disservice, because they do not reflect our lived experience. And then we start to question what's wrong with us, what's wrong with our
Mm-hmm.
family, right? And we need to see ourselves in that messy representation, so that we know that we're not alone in this, and that somehow, even though we can't see it now, we're going to put one foot in front of the other, and we're going to sort of make our way, and that's possible, and that's all we can ask for ourselves at any given moment. So yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite. The favorite thing that I read after my mom died. I looked through everything, and Wild by Cheryl Strayed was something which really is that one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
And I really related to how open she was about all the ways she tried to blow up her own life.
Yeah.
That made so much sense to me. And she was so honest. And I love the Shakespeare quote she puts at the beginning of the book, like the breaking of so great a thing should not make so small a sound. It's
Yes.
like that. I it just that really spoke to me in its honesty.
Yes.
That's what appeals to me. And that's what speaks to me as a writer, and as a human being, and as someone who's grieving and always will be grieving.
Yeah. Yeah. You are a gift. Thank you so much for allowing
Likewise.
your own lived experience and taking your storytelling skills, and to bring this really important, much needed portrayal, honest portrayal of the messiness of families navigating a loss to the stage. We so appreciate you. And I personally just appreciate you for coming on and sharing your story today, and telling this telling us all about it. I know you have other things in the work and you've got a play you're trying to produce, and we're going to make sure that we share all of that in the show notes. And when you follow me on social media at Lisa Keefauver MSW, we'll make sure when this episode goes to air that we've got all the links to find out what incredible other gifts that you're bringing to the world. I'm personally pitching that this gets turned into a movie. I'm just saying, I'm just putting that out in the universe. I
Yep.
think
Yep.
this would be, and if you need a consultant, no, let me go. I'll be there. But I think these kinds of stories are so important for us to be telling, and not the ones that get tied up in a nice little bow. And they can be the roadmaps that all of us need as we navigate this very messy journey. So just thank you so much for everything that you are doing.
Thank you, Lisa, for making the space and creating it. Like, I'm so grateful to have been invited to enter it today.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, listeners, stay tuned for next week's episode. Thank you again for joining me today on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch.